It's funny, as we were talking about that, and then we mentioned the dogs. I recently lost my beloved companion, my chocolate lab. He was almost 10 years old. And, I'd gotten him from the Midwest. I'd gotten him from a rescue. He came from a shelter. He was in a few people's homes before he finally came to me. And unfortunately, I lost him about 2 months ago. And a month later, I got another one. I got a black lab. So you'd think about both of those dogs being from the same tribe. And do you think they act the same? Absolutely not. The one, they both came from the Midwest, but one dog was raised in a very rural area. And, it took me almost, over a month to get him to go to the bathroom on the leash, and not just, he's just used to being let out the back door and have to be, I got to pick up after him on the lawn instead of in the neighborhood. And it's funny, like even within the tribe that exists, there's so many different experiences within that tribe, because they both look like Labrador retrievers, but they both came from the same area, and they could not be two more different dogs.
Well, I mean, that speaks to like the nurture side of that whole conversation, right? That there's a nature part of us all that is the same, that has these same physical defense mechanisms in our body and in our brains that are there for millions of years to keep us safe. But then there's the nurture piece where we're all raised in different contexts, different experiences, different environments, and that can dramatically shape two people. I mean, heck, I'm wildly different than either of my sisters, right? And that's same house, same parents, same basic genetics. There are things about our nurture that make us similar, and then there are things about our
nature that makes you different.
It's interesting to consider. For me, this has been a season of exploring, talking about life in a deeper and a different way. About taking something like these stories and these teachings that we have in the tradition of the church, and trying to reframe them, honestly, in more of a humanistic way, so that it's less about the dogma and using them to reinforce sort of a belief structure, and to see them in more of a human way, and what questions they can raise and what reflections they can trigger that help us to understand, not how to be a better church member, but how to be a better human being, a more healthy and whole human being in the context of our relation to the others in the world around us.
Yeah. So COVID saw us going into the wilderness. And now Governor Wolf and all the other governors, they're saying now it's about time to come out of the wilderness. How do you see us effectively getting out of the wilderness?
Yeah, well, to riff on that metaphor, we're coming out of it, but what we need to be really careful of is making sure that we don't go back the way we came, and just go back to exactly how things were before this season of being thrust out into the dislocation of the wilderness. And so there are some things about reemerging that, logistically will have to be the same. We're going to be able to have people in person again, which will be wonderful. And that's coming really soon for us within the next couple of weeks.
Are we still going to do Zoom as well?
Yeah, but that's the thing that's going to be different, is we now recognize that there are some with whom we can maintain a better relational connection with via Zoom, because either that just better fits them if they're local, or we have folks that Zoom in from California, Ohio, Virginia, who have become part of this community, or have been historically part physically, despite the distance, are now able to still be involved via Zoom. And they're no less a valued member of the body. They still bring their gifts and their wisdom, and they're still sent out from that gathered space to to be an ambassador for goodness and peace in the world. And so, that means that our space where we gather is going to have to integrate some new technological pieces. And we're going to have to adapt some of our patterns to accommodate that. So it's not just going to be exactly as it was. It's going to be in a familiar space, but it's going to be some adapted and some different patterns. I think emerging too from the wilderness, some of the good conversations that are to be had are, okay, what did we really miss?
Yeah.
Because we couldn't do it during the pandemic, and what did we honestly not really miss? What were we doing just because we'd always done it, but it wasn't really an expression of who we understand ourselves to be in the community anymore. So there might be some things that we can trim back in order to focus more of our time and energy on the things that we feel really compelled to do. So I think we'll see, programmatically, some things change also.
Yeah. I know that for me personally, like once we discovered Zoom worship, it was, oh, wow, I don't have to get in the car. I don't have to try to, fight with, 2 or 3 people to get them in the car, to get them on time, to wear the right, wear nice pants, not your joggers. And, and then, now, unfortunately, COVID kind of separated out our household because of needing to maintain tribes, if you will, and keeping people safe and, maintained and contained within their shells and their pods for, preventing the spread of the virus. And then during that time, I was lucky enough to give birth during that time.
Yes,
and now, like, I'm trying to imagine wrestling a baby, getting her into church that she doesn't want to cry. If I'm on Zoom church and she wants to feed, I just turn off the video and we can do our thing, and I can still participate and hear church. If we happen to get down the shore for the weekend, I don't miss church because at 10 o'clock I'm sitting in a different living room. And it's amazing. There's so many,
it's so flexible.
There's great things that we can bring with us, but yes, I do miss sitting in the pew at times. And I was lucky enough that you were able to open up the church for us when it was time to baptize our daughter. And we did we were able to keep, different people distant, kind of come in sit in your appropriate pod.
Sit in your pod.
Most people were vaccinated at that time, and we were able to do it. And it was beautiful. And that was one thing I wanted to be able to have that in person and have her be in the church physically. Just that little thing of it was important to me, where I'm still loving the Zoom concept for actually having church. So I think there's been a lot of opportunity that's been opened up to us. And I'm not just talking about us as our church, but any type of event that we want to attend, on the podcast and through the citizen body, we have a lot of featured artists, and we've talked to our artists and our business people about how they're envisioned for reopening and resuming things. It's like weeding a garden, keep the good plants in, take the weeds out. Now we're finding sometimes what we thought was a good plant might have been a weed, and vice versa. And we can our gardens are going to look a little different, but hopefully it's going to be a better garden in the long run if we make it that way.
Yeah, totally.
Yeah,
absolutely. We're and that's what I was talking about, doing like some programmatic weeding, just to make sure that we have the time and energy we need to do the things that we really want to do. And that's going to get increasingly important for our context in particular, because just given the nature of our evolution as a community, like we're aging, we're getting smaller. We still have this big facility that is going to be our responsibility to maintain. So, finding creative ways moving forward to repurpose a lot of our spaces in ways that are both consistent with what we want to do in the community, but also, are fit within our ability, logistically and financially to maintain. And, what the kinds of things we're talking about, like turning one of our 2 buildings into apartments for those who are housing insufficient. Hopefully some of that will be housing for youth aging out of foster care through supervised independent living program. Hopefully some will be for families of our local community that need emergency transitional housing, but that's a huge undertaking.
Yeah.
And, if we're just caught up in meetings and programs just because we've always done them, we won't have that time and energy available to do those new things that are, consistent with who we understand ourselves to be in that community. And so, so coming out of this wilderness, coming out of the pandemic, part of it is, okay, how do we adapt what we've traditionally done so that it's inclusive of those who connect via Zoom, and so that it's safe for those who come in person. So that's the pod seating and the masking until everyone who wants a vaccine can get one, that sort of thing. But it's also, at a deeper strategic organizational level, how do we need to shift in terms of the management of our time as a resource, so that we can do the things that we feel we can are compelled to do. Because if we don't, then if we don't free up that time and that space within us, we won't be able to change.
So you're really kind of taking the church and transforming it into, and you talk about this a lot in your sermons, but kind of going out into the world and being the church in the community versus trying to bring the church into a building and fit a rigid type of traditional worship that, like so many of us, it's always been the way that we've done it. I've been at the company where I worked for 20 years. And a lot of times when we're trying to think of like a newer, more creative way to do things, there's always been somebody on the committee that says, but we always did this and we've always done it this way. And I've noticed when you're there for a long time, everything kind of goes in a circle. You might start up here with, but this is the way that we started doing it. And then we evolve. And then eventually we end up coming back to
back around. Yeah.
Right back to that same place. But maybe that place looks a little bit different, maybe instead, it's not just like a layer of a circle, but maybe we've grown and we're back in that same place, but with a few different things.
Sure.
So when you're talking about, when you're talking about the building of our church, so we've got that sanctuary that can house about 250 people in the pews. We've got the old auditorium that is now a community cupboard. And then we've got this little annex building that's on the side. How many rooms would you say are in that building?
Well,
I'm going to guess at least 10.
Yeah, there's the original chapel. There are two large nursery school rooms on the bottom level, and then there are 7 or 8 other like former classrooms on the top level. Our initial drawings from the architect that we're working with on this project are that we can fit somewhere between 14 to 16 units in the space. Yeah.
And then how many people would each unit hold? Would it be a household or would it be like a little mini apartment for those people?
Yeah. For the youth coming out of foster care, they'd be individual studio units. But then, we think in that original chapel space, we can actually make some really neat, like lofted style places for, smaller families.
Okay.
Yeah.
Would there be kind of like, because I know like in the basement of it, I'm thinking of the original building and not what you've got an architect working on. Is this like a complete overhaul or like a little?
Yeah, so we can, a lot of, the bones are going to stay, which is great. The term that he uses is we're maintaining the envelope. So, the walls are all going to be in the same places. A lot of the interior walls can stay where they are. Some of them might have to move, or we might need a few walls where there aren't walls now. Obviously all the mechanicals and all the electric and all that stuff would be updated so that it's up to code and safe and the very best that we can offer to others in our community. But from the outside, it will look the same by and large. Yeah.
So would you say like, this is more of like a transitional housing for somebody who's maybe like, for instance, lost their home in a fire, suddenly finds themselves homeless and is working to get back on their feet? Is there any other type of programs that might help them to sustain or to help them to move on? If it's transitional, it's temporary.
Yeah, I helped launch a nonprofit up in Emmaus that did this kind of one family at a time. We rented apartments and homes, and we had sort of a structured program that the participants had to go through, and there were clear expectations on how long they were to stay. And it could be negotiated to be extended if there were circumstances that made it obvious that they weren't ready to move on. But we wanted to give clear goals and a clear time for that transitional housing. So when we talk about hopefully being able to house families who fall on hard times or have the fire or get just socked with a medical bill that bankrupts them and they lose their housing, there's all these reasons. We know that families already are, we've got 40 some families in our small school district that are situationally homeless, living in motels or doubled up with others. So we know the needs there. So when we talk about creating a space for some of those neighbors, there'll be some clear guidelines as to in when they come in and when they go out. When we're talking about the youth aging out of foster care, we're going to work with a partner organization that will administer the supervised independent living program, and so all that administration and all the timing, all the oversight will be what they as an organization do, and we're simply we could choose to be simply a landlord. My hope is that we're not just leasing these to this other nonprofit, but that we take a vested interest in the lives of these people, and find ways to, again, not drag them into our church stuff, but just build relationships and friendships and see how we can care for them as they're maturing out from these really, really hard upbringings.
So again, just to remind you that you are listening or watching the Citizen Body podcast, and we're talking with Tim Dooner. So Tim, just to kind of finish up here, I know lately you've also been preaching from a book called from Tom Rainer, and there's actually two different books that you've been talking about, and they also kind of approach the church. I don't want to say as a business, but kind of one of them is Anatomy of a Revived Church and the Autopsy of a Deceased Church. And a lot of, when we're talking about the, churches that aren't thriving, what do we learn from, what's been a reason that people haven't thrived? What makes a church fold up and close its doors?
Yeah, well, I mean, really, Tom, this guy has been a consultant working in the church world for decades. And so he's been around thousands of case studies. And for him, the one common thread in all of these stories, they're all different, of course, contextually, but the common thread to all of them is that the focus at some point turned inward. And it became about preferences of members of the church rather than about fidelity to its larger mission in the community. And so, that's where you get the budget moving inward. That's where you set up the past as like your hero that you try to forever maintain because that's what you prefer. That's when the neighborhood changes, but the church then doesn't look like the community anymore because it hasn't adapted to be reflective of those who are around it. Buildings and carpets and pews and rooms and all that stuff get kind of idolized, and there's a real resistance to adapting or moving or changing anything. So, and all that comes out of that place where the focus is turned inward. And, and I would argue out of this whole wilderness theme that a lot of that inward focus is just fear of feeling unsafe when things change. And so, we know that these churches haven't done a really good job about, grieving losses and talking through why change is beneficial. They really became, churches became enabled to be self-focused rather than being constantly challenged to be focused on the community. And that's what he talks about in his Autopsy of the Deceased Church, as he shares these common themes and characteristics of churches that, they ran their life cycle and then they closed their doors. But then in the communities he worked with where there was, a sense of revival, he sees the opposite, that there was the ability to overcome, what he calls the trap of traditions, hey, we've always done it this way, and so we always have to do it this way, beyond the resistance to change, beyond the anger and the blame and the resistance that flares up when change is discussed, beyond that sense of, entitlement, and even beyond, such rigid programmatic structures where your meetings and your programs have to stay the same, despite them not being, as good of a fit anymore. So these are the places where people really came to understand that they as an institution, as a community, were those who wanted to be out in the larger community, serving for the sake of something larger than themselves, who understood that unity is not just a gift, but it's an obligation to work out. That and to truly be a force for unity in the world, which I would argue is that core goal of this social movement called Christianity in the world. For there to be true unity, it has to be more than an idea or a sort of a passive tolerance. It's an active struggle toward full inclusion. And so you can't know who isn't included yet if you don't know your neighbors. And so finding those mechanisms for more deeply engaging the community, building relationships, and then we're in a place where, okay, now we can talk about what it actually might look like for everybody to be included in a place of unity.
Yeah. Interesting.
Yeah.
So what we've been seeing is we are hopefully on the revival side of our church. Let me ask you this: have you lost anybody?
Well, yes.
Okay. We don't have to name names.
Yeah, certainly. And I think we're about to lose some more. And I'm saddened by that, but at some point there have to be hard decisions made about, whether our responsibility is club-like to our membership, or whether our responsibility is something larger than ourselves. And so, there are some that I think when we start to change buildings, when we start to talk about changing our patterns in our regular worship gatherings, when we start to have conversations about, whether or not these, having a room full of pews is a good and efficient and faithful use of our space. If that room's only used for 1 hour a week, is that really what we want to do moving forward? When we have that conversation, I think we're going to lose some people who just, and I understand, and I try to be as empathetic as I can, who just can't get over those physical things in them that are afraid of this thing changing. We're going to try our best.
When you said it like that, also, do people hit their limit? Like, they're like, okay, yeah, we're not really using the auditorium that much. Fine, turn it into the cupboard. And then now we're talking about turning that other building into housing. Mm-hmm. And okay, well, yeah, that's a good idea. And now you just, I didn't even think of the concept of changing up the sanctuary.
Yeah.
And not even having the sanctuary. And then to me, I was like, ooh, that hit a little bit.
Well, it's.
But I want to hear more about it. It doesn't make me say no. Oh, okay, now I'm out. I say, because all right, I want to hear what you have to say.
Yeah, because if we commit our second building, which has our nursery school in it, as well as some community organization offices, if we commit that to housing for those who need housing, then that means that we need to relocate our nursery school and these other community pieces into a different space.
I wanted to ask that too. Where's the nursery school going to go?
We don't have any other space. We used to have the hall downstairs, but when the pantry grew fourfold, it really swallowed up that whole space. And I think there's consensus that we need to ride that train as long as it goes. As long as our community needs us to commit all that space to food, that's what we're going to do. Because, gosh, what's more important than make sure everybody has something to eat? But
and again, it's a perfect example of, think big, act small, because
Yeah.
giving to Upper Marion Area Community Cupboard is, you really see the impact in your community. You know that that is going directly to the person. I'm guessing there's no overhead operating costs as much, because they're really kind of being absorbed by the church.
Yeah.
And
Yeah.
when you want to make a difference, that's where it's coming. And sometimes when you give to those global organizations that say, oh yeah, stamp out world hunger and send your check to so-and-so, when you're writing that check that they're a large chunk, or at least a pretty big proportion of the percentage of what you're giving is going towards overhead operating costs, the mailers that they're sending you every month in the mail that you're not even responding to most of the time. That's where a lot of that money gets eaten up when you give to a local organization such as this in our community. And if you're not from our community, please go out there and find the community that speaks to you, that's in your area, because when you get rid of that hunger where you live, that's when that effect is going to reach outward and not inward.
Yeah, totally. Yeah, the space is an in-kind gift of the church, and we have one part-time staff person that we had to hire just to help coordinate the whole thing when it exploded during the pandemic. And she's a young woman just out of college who's amazing and has an incredible depth of compassion for her community. She was raised here. She's a graduate of the local high school. So many of those dollars just go right to food. That goes right out the door. So that space is, we've kind of written that off. That is the space for food, to feed those who need that gift. And so, the sanctuary really is the only other space under roof that we have. And I understand, the attachment to the way that it looks and functions now. I've thought often about, the church I grew up in, Paoli, like if that were to be dramatically changed, how would I feel about that? And I would have the same gut reaction of, something
really?
About that. Really, do we have to do that? Can't we just build another building? But we're trying to figure out if the nursery school can use sort of an open concept model, or if that traditional nursery school is even what our community needs the most now. I think Pennsylvania, if not nationally, there's some momentum building toward universal pre-K. And if that happens, is traditional nursery school even going to be a necessary thing anymore? Is that going to be swallowed up by public education? So we're talking about, what's the best way to care for, our families with preschool kids in the local community? What can we do in more of a flexible space that's more of an open space? So that during the week, it could be a place where families and children are nurtured and cared for, where they can play and grow and learn. But then on Sundays, we set it up for us to gather. And there's a spot where we're gathered with each other, and we have these exercises and practices that get us thinking and reflecting and growing, and hopefully seeing the world around us differently. And then there's space for us to get up, and there's space to grab coffee or sit down and have lunch together before it is rearranged again for Monday and the kids come back in. Or is there another like community initiative that could exist within that space that does what we were compelled to do in our community, that we couldn't do if that room was reserved 24/7 for pews that are empty except for 1 hour a week. And that's a huge yes, to commit
and then
to commit the
when
hall.
we talk about traditional things, then I mean, what other than that 1 hour a week, that sanctuary does host other functions such as weddings and funerals.
Yeah.
And when's the last time you did a wedding or a funeral in the church?
We've had several memorials, unfortunately, during the pandemic season. I've never had a wedding there, and I don't know when the last one was. But we're going to maintain the aesthetics. The front wall is going to stay the same. The wood tones are all going to stay the same. we're gonna keep our communion table and maybe one of the lectern areas, and we can seat if we have seats, then we can seat ourselves however we want. So if we're gathering on a Sunday morning and we're saying now, oh, post COVID, because of Zoom, we've really gotten used to seeing each other face to face and not just looking at the back of your head. And so when on a Sunday morning, why don't we set ourselves in a way that we can see each other? And it's easier for us to interact. But then if it's a wedding or a funeral, and we're more used to there being like a center aisle where we can process, and people are up front, then we can set the room that way. And we'll still be looking at the same front wall. The windows and the decorations will still be the same around us. The floor will likely be somewhat different, but a similar tone. So it won't be exactly the same, but we're hoping aesthetic. Well, I would hope that if we do this, that there's enough about the room that in honoring where we truly are is similar to our past, but not exactly the same.
Yeah.
Because we have been through the wilderness, and whether COVID happened or not, the church really needed to go into the wilderness to have this time of soul searching and understand better what it is and what it could be in the community. COVID expedited that. It forced us to do it. But we needed to do it 20 years ago. So, I imagine, that the hall changing to the food, the other building changing to housing, the sanctuary changing to be used for these other things, but then having these pieces that make it feel familiar, that really honors where we are, which is in some ways a similar place and in some ways a very different place. And that's going to help us to build our tolerance to things being different.
Yeah. And there is definitely a tolerance to build. I remember the church used to host something, and this, when you said 20 plus years ago, this was in the back of my head as we were talking about the space and just remembering like all the great things that it was used for. And I remember one pastor at a certain time had wanted to use the space and did use the space for hosting something called One Night at a Time. Mm-hmm. Is that program still in use?
There are versions of that model that exist, in other localities. It's not around Upper Marion anymore. That model where different community organizations take turn hosting, homeless families in shifts throughout the year, so that there's constant coverage and a safe place for them to be. That's not really a thing in Upper Marion anymore.
I think
I'm not sure it's in Norristown either.
Yeah, but I remember like we did it in sister churches in a neighboring community called Norristown, where folks would stay literally one night at a time, but they're packing up their stuff and then they're moving on to the next safe haven and then the next one and the next one. And I remember, I think we were like, we would be every Wednesday for a month or something like that, or it would just be, or if it was the entire month of March. And then they were hosting. I remember the pastors at in the church leadership at the time really facing some backlash. Some people, some people were all for it and some people were dead set against it. And it's really, rethinking how you use that space and, and was it safe? And again, there's, I think it's fair to say that the, crime level in our communities is so much higher. Now, it's not that it wasn't there then, but, people were really worried about it now. And I don't even know if a program like that would even go over nowadays.
Yeah. Well, to your point about there being some opposition, there was a member of the church who actually went to the municipality and tried to torpedo the thing at his own church, so that certainly raised some significant resistance. I also think that one of the reasons why that program may not be here anymore is because it really was triage. It was treating the symptoms and it wasn't actually seeking to cure the cause. So I think there's been a pretty decent shift over the last 10, 20 years in the conversation about homelessness toward, just providing housing first. And, how it's such a multi-layered, complex social problem for someone that ends up being in this place of homelessness. It's not just about the home. It's about, emotional scars, mental illness, drug abuse, drug and alcohol abuse, developmental disabilities. There's so many, and we learned this in Emmaus when we did this one family at a time in apartments and houses too, transitional housing for months at a time. It was every week meeting with a family, healing back the layers of their dysfunction. Not that we ever completely cured anybody, but by just giving them a safe place to be, knowing that they weren't going to have to pack up and move on like every night to somewhere new, allowed them a sense of safety, allowed these physical things in them to calm down so that they could actually logically, rationally start to peel away some of these layers that were contributing toward their homelessness. It's amazing, the legal, financial, health, mental issues that were all commingled in like one person, one family. And if they're just in survival mode, bouncing from place to place, they can't address any of that. And they don't have any advocate or any friend to help them. So if we can create a place where someone can just be for longer than a night at a time, that gives a much better chance of them finding some more holistic health.
Yeah. So one night at a time is really kind of more like a Band-Aid program for just kind of patching things up and making it work for right now. But what you're talking about is more like, let's fix the root of the problem. And then hopefully we work towards a way of eliminating the problem in the first place.
Yeah, exactly. I think they had supports. I think they had staff persons that were to help to transport people and also to help do some good social work with them. But again, if you're bouncing around from place to place, you can't ever get settled, in my opinion. You can't get settled enough to really deal with a lot of it. You have to know that you're going to be safe tomorrow in order to think critically today.
Yeah.
And so that's one thing. That's one thing we're hoping to do for our community, is to create that place. Whether it's a youth coming out of foster care and trying to unpack all of that emotional trauma, or whether it's a family that had the fire or fell on hard times or has all these complicated financial, legal, health issues, to give them a safe place that they know is going to be safe tomorrow and next week and the week after that. We think we can actually help them better.
Yeah.
I
agree. I really think that we can.
Yeah.
So just to remind everybody that this was your Citizen Body podcast. And Tim, just one more question. When people are, how do you deal with the resistance to change?
Oh, gosh. Everybody's such a different creature. It's hard to generalize. I really try and meet everybody where they are and hear their concerns, do my very best to articulate, why the change is beneficial, it's good. And, and in the church world, we also use language like, and this is what we were taught to do by Jesus, that we hold at the center of the social construct and worldview that we've adopted, or this is our sense of what, the guidance of God has for us, that as we understand God to be a God of all peoples, who has created the world to be this place where all can be together in unity and flourish. How can we participate in seeing that godly vision to a reality? I try to acknowledge and hear the pain, and always create a space for more conversation, more questions. We try to move at a deliberate pace through change, but at some point you have to actually do it, and so you can't kick the can down the road for too long. So creating enough time and space for concerns to be raised, for that resistance to present itself, to narrate why we feel compelled, and we were very careful and intentional in planning for this change, and then continuing to try our very best to hold on to our relationships and our connection. to those who are struggling with it.
Yeah.
But you asked earlier, have we lost anybody? Yes, and we'll lose some more. There are some that just won't physically, mentally be able to handle it. And so, in that case, I've tried to refer those individuals to other communities of faith where they can go and belong and heal. And we hope that they are able to see to it that they heal, calm, and then come back. But that's all in good time. Who knows?
Yeah. Well, Tim, it's great having you on the Citizen Bodycast. And
hey, thanks.
Anybody who's interested in participating in Zoom worship, it's valleyforgepres.org. And you can find a link to the Zoom, to our Zoom worships every Sunday at 10. Is it fair to invite folks to come and join us?
Oh, absolutely. Yeah, no, we're not a club. There are no strangers. One of my favorite sayings is there's no strangers, there are only friends who haven't met yet. So yeah, anybody's welcome. We're trying to be a really open, inclusive group of people that make everybody feel as though they belong, and to put that belonging before belief. If belief, faith, spirituality, if that comes from the belonging, that's wonderful, of course. But there's no one that's going to be turned away at the door or not let into the Zoom room. Sure.
The Zoom room's open for everybody.
Yeah.
And so are the doors. When the church does reopen, the doors are open as well. So we're valleyforgepres.org, and you can participate on Zoom from anywhere. And also Upper Marion Area Community Covered, umacc.com.
Org.
Okay, umacc.org. So learn a little bit more about what the good things that are going on there, and click to donate. And again, also, as always, the citizenbody.com. You can find more of our content there. And again, if you're liking the content that we're bringing you, please hit the donate button, the little red one, I think, that's down there, and subscribe to our newsletter. John puts a lot of work and thought into the weekly content that goes into the newsletter. And again, it's a lot like our News Source 1440 that we subscribe to. They give us the news in a very non-threatening, non-partisan manner. I can just read the news, not get stressed out about it. I could spend 2 minutes, or I could do a deeper dive into that. And again, Tim, thanks for being here.
Thanks for having me.
Yeah, it was great. I think John will be happy. We did a Citizen Body that went well over an hour, and I think it was an hour that was well worth, an hour and a half that was well worth all of our time. So again, thanks, Tim, and see you on Sunday. And for the rest of our podcast world out there, see you guys next time. Take care.
Awesome.
Yeah.